In ancient Rome, people didn't just watch fights. They watched executions. 50,000 citizens cheering, a woman locked inside a bronze bull, and a living beast released to end the scene. They called it a game, but it was law, ritual, and warning. For 4 centuries, Rome turned cruelty into ceremony and death into obedience. These weren't myths. They were 11 real games that shocked the empire itself. If you value the historical record, stay. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak. When Emperor Titus inaugurated the Colosseum in 80 AD, it wasn't just a celebration. It was a declaration of power. 50,000 people packed the marble seats, roaring as blood splattered across the sand. A woman, stripped naked, was forced inside a hollow bronze bull. When the fire lit beneath, the metal glowed red, and her screams echoed through the beast's mouth, sounding like the roar of an animal. This was not random cruelty. It was theatre, the recreation of the Greek myth of Pasiphae, the queen who mated with a bull. Rome staged this legend not to entertain, but to sanctify dominance. The crowd was told it symbolized moral justice, punishing sin. But it was propaganda, myth weaponized into control. The poet Martial, who witnessed it, wrote, "We saw Pasiphae joined to the bull. The ancient legend received testimony under Caesar." To him, it was refinement, proof that Rome could turn even legend into flesh. Behind the spectacle stood a machinery colder than any battlefield. Every death was planned, costed, and recorded. Slaves were assets. Beasts were imported cargo. Execution was public bookkeeping. Rome's genius was not invention. It was administration, to turn human suffering into logistics. Through repetition, obedience became instinct. Citizens learned to cheer at the sight of agony, to equate law with punishment, and to find order in cruelty. Seneca the philosopher later confessed, "I come home more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans." The arena changed not only the victims, it reshaped the spectators. When violence becomes routine, conscience becomes irrelevant. And yet, these games did not begin with the Colosseum. They began centuries earlier, in a cattle market that smelled of dung and blood. 3 sons stood beside their father's tomb, wishing to honor him not with prayers, but with death. They armed 6 slaves, 3 pairs, and made them fight until the ground was soaked. The crowd called it munus, a duty to the dead. But that duty became spectacle. Elites saw its power. A funeral with bloodshed proved wealth. A grander slaughter proved dominance. From that moment, Rome discovered a truth darker than any myth. Killing could be ritual, and ritual could be governance. A single act of mourning became the blueprint for empire. From one puddle of blood came an ocean, and the question that haunted every scream was this: when death becomes entertainment, what's left of humanity? It began not in the Colosseum, but in a cattle market. 264 years before Christ, in the city of Rome, before marble, before emperors, there stood a simple wooden stage beside the Forum Boarium. The air stank of dung, smoke, and sweat. And in the center of it, 3 sons prepared to honor their dead father. Not with offerings, not with prayers, but with blood. They armed 6 slaves, 3 pairs, and ordered them to fight to the death. The crowd gathered, curious at first. It was supposed to be a solemn rite, a munus, a duty owed to the deceased. But as the blood hit the ground, something changed. The mourning turned to excitement. Grief turned into applause. The audience had tasted something new, the illusion of control over life and death. That day, Rome invented its first arena. At the time, Romans claimed they borrowed the custom from their enemies, the Campanians and Samnites, who believed the spirits of the dead demanded blood to rest. But what Rome saw wasn't religion. It was opportunity. The elites realized that death could be used, not just to appease spirits, but to command the living. By the 3rd century BC, noble families began hosting funeral games not to mourn, but to campaign. The more blood spilled, the greater the prestige. Coffins became stages, and the dead became excuses for performance. The Senate praised it as piety, pietas, devotion to ancestors. But the crowd knew better. It was politics written in blood. Rome's historian Livy later recorded the transition bluntly. From mourning, it turned to spectacle. Each match became a performance of hierarchy. The men who fought were not citizens. They were slaves, prisoners, foreigners. Their deaths reaffirmed the social order. When the victor stood over the corpse, the audience saw more than combat. They saw Rome itself triumphant, even in miniature. The armor told stories. The Samnite gladiator wore the same curved shield and plumed helmet as the tribe Rome had conquered. His very presence was propaganda, a living memory of victory. Every slash, every wound was a reenactment of conquest. The funeral became a history lesson written in blood. Soon, competition among Rome's elites escalated. Funerals turned into contests of cruelty. Politicians bankrupted themselves trying to outdo one another with grander, bloodier games. The more spectacular the violence, the more votes it bought. And the people learned something dangerous. Their attention had value. What began as piety evolved into commerce. Each noble sought to outshine the last. One hosted 10 duels, another 20, then 100. When one aristocrat brought in trained fighters from Capua, the crowd's cheers were deafening. He won his election. From that moment, gladiators ceased to be servants of the dead. They became servants of ambition. Rome's republic was learning to buy loyalty with blood. But the change wasn't only political. It was philosophical. The Romans believed virtue, virtus, came from endurance, discipline, and mastery over fear. Watching a man die silently, without flinching, became a moral example. The arena wasn't just entertainment. It was a sermon about control. The spectator learned to admire not compassion, but composure. The Stoics, Rome's philosophers of reason, twisted this logic further. They claimed the spectacle trained citizens to face death without fear, to witness agony and remain unmoved. In their writings, the dying gladiator was not a victim, but a teacher. The result was chilling. Cruelty became education. By the time of Julius Caesar, the transformation was complete. The munus, once a family ritual, had become a civic institution. Caesar, campaigning for power, staged massive funeral games in honor of his father. He filled the forum with hundreds of pairs of fighters, imported exotic animals, and built temporary wooden stands for the crowds. What had begun in a cattle market now echoed through marble streets. Pliny the Elder wrote, From the blood of slaves, the people learned to love death. And love it they did. Beneath the noise of applause was a quiet economy, one of flesh and profit. Training schools began to emerge in Capua and Rome, where Lannistae, professional managers, bought, trained, and rented fighters to politicians. Contracts were signed, profits split, deaths scheduled. Rome had industrialized killing long before it mechanized anything else. Every funeral became a ledger, every life an entry. When a gladiator died, his owner was compensated from the host's account, a transaction logged by clerks. Blood had become a form of currency. What had once been duty to the dead had become a marketplace for murder. And the strangest part, the audience believed it was noble. They were told these deaths honored ancestors, purified the city, pleased the gods. In truth, it pleased Rome's elite. Each corpse beneath the sand was a coin spent on influence. The Republic's politicians discovered a formula. Spectacle equals loyalty. And once that formula worked, it never stopped. From funeral rites came elections. From elections came empire. The stage of death grew, from the Forum to the Colosseum. By the 1st century BC, the Romans no longer even pretended it was about the dead. The munus had outlived its meaning, but not its momentum. Citizens demanded more. The games grew bloodier, the beasts more exotic, the scripts more elaborate. And behind it all, a single principle endured. Death as performance equals power maintained. A society built on the admiration of pain could not stop. The same citizens who once prayed for peace now prayed for tickets. The same Senate that once outlawed murder now funded mass execution. Rome had learned to hide its violence behind ceremony, its corruption behind applause. And as the sands darkened with blood, the crowd forgot that this began as a funeral. Because the greatest trick the empire ever performed was convincing its people that cruelty was culture and obedience was virtue. But if blood could win loyalty, Rome wondered, what could fear itself achieve? That's what came next, when the empire stopped killing for the dead and began killing for pleasure. By the 1st century BC, Rome had perfected the art of death. What began as small funeral duels had become an industry, a machinery of spectacle. But the Republic was still hungry. Death alone was not enough. It needed wonder, suspense, and scale. It needed monsters. So, Rome turned to the natural world. The amphitheater became not just a place for men to die, but for the wild to be conquered. From North Africa came lions, from Armenia, tigers, from the Nile, crocodiles, from the deserts of Arabia, ostriches and leopards. All dragged across thousands of miles, chained, starving, terrified, to die in the sand for applause. They called these events venationes, hunts. But they were not hunts. They were executions disguised as adventure. The beasts were starved for days, then released before crowds of 50,000. Some shows pitted animals against each other. Lions versus bears, bulls versus elephants, until the arena became a chaos of blood and fur. The crowd screamed not in horror, but in ecstasy. Julius Caesar, master of propaganda, understood the value of spectacle better than any general. In 46 BC, after his victory over Gaul, he hosted games that lasted weeks. He paraded a giraffe through Rome, the first ever seen in Europe. The people called it a camelopardalis because they had no word for it. Then Caesar ordered it killed. The message was simple. If Rome could capture the strangest creature alive, it could capture anything. Nature itself bowed to empire. The poet Propertius later wrote that Caesar's games proved even the wild obeys Rome. It was not a lie. The logistics alone were staggering. Lions trapped in Numidia were marched across the Sahara, loaded onto ships bound for Ostia, then dragged by carts to the Colosseum's cages. Hundreds died on the journey, of thirst, of suffocation, of fear. The empire built a supply chain of slaughter that stretched from Britain to Syria. Every province had a role. North Africa provided beasts, Gaul provided slaves, Asia provided exotic trainers. The arena was the empire in miniature, a system that turned the farthest corners of the world into a single, synchronized theater of obedience. By the time of Emperor Titus, the process had become bureaucratic. Records from municipal archives mention the transport of 18 panthers from Carthage and 2 elephants from Alexandria, each with exact costs and handlers listed. Rome did not improvise cruelty, it scheduled it. At the Colosseum's opening festival in 80 AD, 9,000 animals were slaughtered in one celebration. That's 90 per day, torn apart, speared, or decapitated before cheering citizens. Archaeologists have found bones from lions, bears, and even ostriches buried beneath the Colosseum's floor, some etched with marks of deliberate starvation. They were weakened before combat to ensure a swift, dramatic death. Behind the scenes, the work was relentless. Hundreds of men toiled in underground tunnels, hypergea, raising cages with pulleys, releasing beasts on cue like actors in a deadly ballet. What looked like chaos above was precision below. Every roar, every scream was orchestrated. But the arena did more than display death. It made ideology visible. When a lion killed a prisoner, it wasn't just nature devouring man. It was empire devouring rebellion. The spectators learned that Rome's reach extended to every species, every realm. Even philosophers saw the lesson. The historian Cassius Dio later wrote, "These hunts taught the citizens that the empire ruled not only men, but the earth itself." And that was the point. Each venatio was a sermon about power. The beasts weren't enemies. They were symbols of resistance, dragged into submission for the crowd to witness. But there was a deeper layer still, one that made the Colosseum not just a political theatre, but an ecological graveyard. Pliny the Elder warned that Rome's hunger for rare animals was wiping them out. "The world," he wrote, "is growing empty for our pleasures." By the 2nd century, lions were nearly extinct in North Africa. The leopards of Cappadocia vanished from the mountains. Herds of elephants that once roamed Syria disappeared entirely. The Colosseum didn't just consume men, it consumed creation. And yet, the people wanted more. They grew addicted to the scale, to the rhythm of annihilation. The empire obliged. By the reign of Trajan, the spectacles lasted 123 consecutive days. Thousands of prisoners and animals killed. It was no longer enough to see Rome defeat the wild. The audience wanted variation, story, and suspense. The hunts evolved into scenes, mythological plays written in blood. One day, Actaeon chased by hounds. The next, Hercules slaying a lion. Only, in Rome's version, the roles were played by the condemned. The crowd saw art. The victims saw hell. Philosophers called this civilization. They argued that the arena united the empire, rich and poor, senators and slaves, all equal before the thrill of death. In truth, it united them only in complicity. A society that could cheer while elephants screamed and men burned was no longer a community. It was an audience. And the audience never asked who paid for the show, because the real victims were invisible. The slaves who hauled the cages, the traders who died on the road, the animals that starved in the holds of Roman ships. Every cheer above the sand echoed across continents. By the end of the 1st century, the arena had become the empire's beating heart, a place where faith, commerce, and cruelty fused. The games were no longer rituals for the dead, but rituals for power. The emperors understood this perfectly. The more chaotic the world outside, the more wars, plagues, and uprisings, the louder the applause inside. Rome didn't conquer through the sword alone. It conquered through spectacle. But as the appetite grew, so did the imagination. The people began to crave more than blood. They wanted stories written in it. And that desire would give birth to the next evolution of Rome's cruelty, when the condemned would no longer just die. They would perform their own deaths. By the height of the empire, death in the arena had become theatre. And like any theatre, it had rules, scripts, and a director. The Colosseum was no longer a place of battle. It was a factory of spectacle. Every movement, every scream, every drop of blood was engineered to entertain, to instruct, and above all, to control. The Romans called it spectaculum, but it was closer to bureaucracy than chaos. Somewhere between the stench of blood and the cheers of 50,000 throats was a quiet efficiency, a system that turned killing into public service. When you picture a gladiator, you might imagine two men of equal strength locked in noble combat, steel flashing beneath the sun. That image is a lie, a myth polished by poets and modern films. The truth is colder. Most gladiators never had a fair chance. They were prisoners, slaves, debtors, or rebels forced to fight professionals trained to kill. The crowd didn't want balance. It wanted certainty. The thrill was not in who would win, but in how beautifully the loser would die. The retiarius, light and quick, armed with a net and trident, was pitted against the secutor, whose helmet was designed specifically to block the net. It wasn't a test of skill, it was a performance of inevitability. The crowd loved the moment the net missed, the instant of panic, the blade plunging through the ribs. Sometimes one gladiator faced two, or even three. Other times, criminals were thrown in without weapons, forced to mime fighting before being cut down. It was theatre of humiliation. Rome didn't just kill, it choreographed suffering. Helmets were deliberately heavy, making fighters stumble half-blind. The armor wasn't protection, it was punishment. Every disadvantage was engineered to prolong agony and maximize applause. The historian Quintilian wrote that even in death, the gladiator must appear graceful. The crowd didn't want mercy, they wanted choreography. A good death was an art form, one that made Rome's violence look civilized. By the 1st century AD, the games had their own genres, like a modern entertainment industry. There were munera, duels between trained fighters, venationes, animal hunts, noxi, executions of criminals, and naumachiae, mock naval battles staged in flooded arenas. Each type served a political purpose. The duels glorified courage, the hunts glorified empire, the executions glorified law. Every spectacle reinforced Rome's hierarchy: citizens in the seats, slaves in the sand. Watching others die was not simply fun, it was instruction. The message was repeated until it became instinct. Rome commands, the rest obey. The philosopher Seneca admitted that the midday executions, the meridiani, were the worst. "I come home," he wrote, "more greedy, more cruel, more inhuman, because I have been among humans." He described criminals tied to stakes while lions and bears were released, the crowd betting on which would die slower. It is pure murder dressed as play. And yet he stayed to watch. Why? Because the arena didn't only display Rome's violence, it manufactured complicity. To cheer was to belong. To turn away was to question the empire itself. And no one questioned Rome. The sociologist in us might call it conditioning. The Romans called it patriotism. By making citizens witness death, the state created a shared ritual, one that erased empathy and replaced it with pride. Every execution became a miniature conquest, a reenactment of empire in miniature. The spectators left feeling cleansed, reassured that order had been restored, that chaos had once again been defeated. But for those forced to die, there was no order, only spectacle. Criminals, rebels, deserters, and slaves were dressed as clowns or monsters. They were told to fight with wooden swords against armored killers. Their screams were part of the sound design. When they fell, the crowd laughed. Children pointed. Vendors shouted for wine. The arena became Rome's moral classroom, teaching its citizens that justice meant domination, that laughter could erase guilt, that cruelty was the natural rhythm of life. Even the emperors learned the power of this performance. Augustus ordered that no Roman citizen be killed in the arena, only foreigners and slaves, a legal distinction that made cruelty appear just. Law became theatre, and theatre became governance. This was not madness, it was method. Cassius Dio, one of Rome's most meticulous historians, calculated that more money was spent on games than on education, healthcare, or roads. By the 2nd century, entire bureaucracies managed the logistics. Accountants for weapons, veterinarians for beasts, scribes for casualties. The killing was budgeted. Rome had turned death into an economy. The amphitheatre was both court and classroom, spectacle and sermon. Every stab was a lesson, every scream a warning. When you watched a man die for disobedience, you learned what Rome expected. When you cheered, you proved you had learned. But even this system of choreographed suffering was not enough. The empire's appetite was growing. The crowd began to crave more shock, more spectacle, more meaning. They wanted not just to see men die, they wanted to see them perform their deaths. And so, Rome crossed a line that no civilization had dared cross before. The condemned would become actors in living myths. They would not simply be killed, they would reenact their own destruction. A prisoner would become Orpheus, singing to beasts before being torn apart. Another would become Daedalus, flying with crude wings before plunging to his death. Women would be forced to play Pasiphae, reenacting the obscene myth before a roaring crowd. The arena would become the empire's stage, a mirror of its own mythology, where gods, monsters, and mortals bled together in the sand. And through that horror, Rome would perfect the greatest illusion in history. That cruelty, when wrapped in ritual, could look like art. By the 2nd century AD, the line between justice and theatre had vanished. Rome no longer killed just to punish. It killed to perform. Executions were rewritten as myths, ancient stories replayed with living bodies, where criminals became actors, and pain became a script. The Romans called it damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. But that phrase was deceptive. It wasn't merely feeding humans to lions. It was ritualized storytelling, religion turned spectacle, punishment turned pornography. Midday at the Colosseum, the sunlight blazed white over the sand. The crowd, still buzzing from the morning's duels, waited for something new, something more artistic. Trumpets blared. Slaves dragged out painted backdrops of forests, mountains, temples. Then came the condemned, dressed as characters from legend. The message was unmistakable. The empire owned not only its enemies, but its myths. One day, a prisoner was forced to play Orpheus, the musician who charmed beasts with his song. In the myth, the animals gather peacefully around him. But in the arena, Rome rewrote the ending. As the man began to sing, handlers released a bear from the shadows. The creature mauled him before he could finish his melody. The poet Martial, who witnessed it, wrote bitterly, "If he had delayed, the beasts might have obeyed." Another man, condemned for theft, was cast as Icarus. He was fitted with crude wings of wax and feathers, hoisted above the crowd, then dropped, not into the sea, but onto waiting swords. When his broken body hit the sand, the crowd gasped, not in pity, but in awe at the realism. Others played Daedalus, Pyramus, or Prometheus. Each story ended the same way: death as art, agony as applause. But none shocked Rome like the myth of Pasiphae. A woman, often a slave or prisoner, was forced into a bronze replica of a cow, a perverse reconstruction of the Greek legend in which the Cretan queen mated with a bull. Then a real bull was released. Sometimes she was gored, sometimes burned alive inside the metal beast. The audience roared with laughter. The poet Tertullian, writing decades later, condemned the scene. Women are paraded naked as priestesses, defiled before their deaths. The crowd calls it theatre. The gods call it blasphemy. But Rome's officials defended it. They said it honored tradition, a moral play about sin and consequence. Law justified lust. Faith justified blood. This was Rome's true genius, to turn horror into lesson, and lesson into law. By transforming myth into execution, Rome rewrote the boundaries of morality. The Colosseum became a living scripture, where the gods themselves seemed to demand cruelty. It taught that every disobedience, from theft to rebellion, had a divine echo, a story to justify the pain. An arsonist might be cast as Heracles and burned alive in a parody of his fiery death. A traitor might be dressed as Pentheus, torn limb from limb for mocking the divine. A thief could become Prometheus, chained to a rock while vultures pecked his flesh. Each punishment carried its symbolism. Each execution became theology in motion. This wasn't random sadism. It was systematized spectacle. The state provided funds for props. Artisans built mechanical sets, and priests blessed the sand before the slaughter. Inscriptions on surviving amphitheaters mention entire departments devoted to stagecraft. Painters, costume makers, machinists who operated lifts that raised victims from below like ghosts emerging from Hades. One account from the historian Strabo described an elaborate scene where prisoners were tied to trees, then torn apart by wild bulls yoked with flaming torches. The crowd placed wagers, he wrote, on how long each man would scream before he was split. It was not justice, it was administration. Behind the violence lay a message so effective that no decree could match it. Rebellion ends in ridicule. When a man is made to die as a fool, his cause dies with him. Women suffered uniquely in this system. The satirist Juvenal mocked female gladiators, Ludia, fighting half-naked before jeering crowds. Yet, records confirm they existed, their names engraved on tombs: Amazonia, Aquileia, Mivia. For the Romans, their humiliation was part of the thrill. Seeing a woman stripped of modesty, dignity, and life was proof that no one stood above the empire's will. Even the divine feminine, goddesses, priestesses, queens, was profaned. Mythic heroines were reenacted by slaves in chains. Every myth that once symbolized passion, loyalty, or defiance was twisted into a morality play about submission. The arena became Rome's altar, and its priests wore blood instead of robes. By now, cruelty had become a kind of grammar. Every citizen spoke it fluently. Children grew up mimicking executions in their games. Merchants sold miniature gladiator dolls, their weapons cast in bronze. The violence had become invisible, normalized, embedded in the language of glory. The philosopher Augustine, born centuries later, recalled his friend Alypius, who vowed never to watch the games. But once dragged there by his peers, he looked and could not look away. He saw, he shouted, he was drunk on blood, Augustine wrote. He was no longer himself. That was Rome's power. It didn't merely kill bodies, it converted minds. The condemned were props, the audience accomplices. And together, they built the illusion of eternal order, an empire whose moral code was written in screams. But as the crowd grew numb to even the most elaborate deaths, Rome faced a new problem. How do you shock people who have seen everything? How do you make death feel new? The answer was audacious and insane. If land could no longer satisfy, Rome would conquer water itself. If the Colosseum was too small, the empire would flood it and make men die at sea. That was the next stage of Rome's spectacle. Naumachia, mock naval battles, staged not for war, but for wonder. And in the process, Rome discovered that even the ocean could be engineered for cruelty. When land could no longer contain Rome's imagination, it turned to the sea. The empire that had conquered continents now wanted to command water itself and drown men for applause. They called it Naumachia, the naval battle. It sounded noble, but what happened was not war. It was execution disguised as spectacle. Julius Caesar staged the first of these horrors in 46 BC. He dug a massive basin near the Tiber River, filled it with water, and filled it with men, not soldiers, but captives. Thousands of condemned prisoners were chained to ships, handed real weapons, and told to fight to the death. They weren't actors, they were slaves. When the trumpets blared and the ships clashed, the crowd saw heroism. But what they were watching was mass drowning. The historian Suetonius described it bluntly. The basin ran red, and the crowd cheered as the water turned to blood. Rome didn't need victory. It needed theatre. And what better way to prove divine power than to command the ocean itself? Caesar's basin was only the beginning. Every emperor after him tried to outdo the last. Augustus, eager to display Rome's engineering might, ordered the construction of an artificial lake so vast it required a new aqueduct to fill it. 30 warships were launched. 3,000 men fought to the death, while the emperor watched from a marble pavilion. It was a triumph of logistics and lunacy. The cost was astronomical. Tens of thousands of workers dug canals for months. Grain shipments were diverted to feed the builders. But the expense didn't matter. For Rome, spectacle was a form of rule. Each wave of blood reminded citizens that the emperor's power reached even the elements. Then came Claudius. In 52 AD, he drained Lake Fucine, a natural body of water in central Italy, just to stage his own Naumachia. 19,000 prisoners were forced to fight as rival fleets. When the emperor appeared, they saluted with the now immortal line, Ave, Caesar, morituri te salutant. Hail, Caesar, those who are about to die salute you. It wasn't poetry, it was resignation. Claudius laughed, gave the signal, and the slaughter began. Ships collided, men screamed, arrows rained, catapults launched flaming pitch. When it ended, the survivors begged for mercy, but mercy was never the point. Claudius ordered his archers to kill those who tried to flee. The crowd cheered, senators toasted, children clapped. Rome had made mass execution a family outing. It's easy to mistake these spectacles for madness, but they were deliberate, meticulously planned, brutally rational. A naumachia required vast teams, engineers to dig and flood, carpenters to build ships, soldiers to guard the captives, musicians to time the drums. The emperor himself was the director, the sea his stage, the dying his orchestra. The amphitheatre was even designed for it. The Colosseum's architects built an intricate system of channels beneath the arena, valves and tunnels that could flood the floor in minutes. Archaeologists have uncovered traces of these mechanisms. Bronze gates, clay pipes, waterproof concrete. Rome didn't improvise bloodshed, it designed it. When the water level rose, the crowd gasped in delight. The sand became ocean, and the prisoners became sailors of doom. In a single day, hundreds would drown, their bodies later drained away with the water. The next morning, the arena was dry again, ready for another round of death. Cruelty had become hydraulics. Each Naumachia was a mirror of Rome's own imperial fantasy, a world in which the impossible bowed to the emperor's will. What was water, if not another frontier to be mastered? What were men, if not waves to be broken? The historian Cassius Dio remarked, "Even nature obeyed the emperor's command." That obedience was the real message. The spectacle wasn't for the condemned, it was for the citizens, to remind them that Rome could make oceans rise and men vanish with the same gesture. The Naumachia turned the act of drowning into a civic virtue. It made destruction look like order and waste like wealth. Every drop of water reflected power. Every corpse reflected obedience. But the psychological effect ran deeper. The audience began to equate death with beauty, to see the synchronization of violence as proof of civilization. When Claudius drained Lake Fucine, he wasn't just hosting a game. He was demonstrating that chaos itself could be engineered. To control nature was to control destiny. The moral, if you could call it that, was terrifyingly consistent. Nothing, not man, not beast, not sea, stood beyond Rome's dominion. And yet, within that control lay a paradox. As the empire expanded its appetite for spectacle, it became addicted to its own illusions. Each emperor had to outshine the last. Each show had to be bigger, bloodier, more extravagant. The citizens who once feared the gods now feared boredom. By the 2nd century, the logistics of cruelty consumed the treasury. The philosopher Seneca warned, "We spend more to watch men die than to keep men alive." He wasn't exaggerating. Records show Rome spent more on games than on its legions during times of peace. Spectacle had replaced victory, and the emperor, surrounded by cheering crowds, mistook applause for stability. The Colosseum's flooded floor drained back to sand, but the message lingered. The audience had seen the ocean obey. They had seen men drown like waves at the emperor's command. For Rome, that wasn't entertainment. It was theology. Every Naumachia was a sermon about divine power, the emperor as God, the people as witnesses, the condemned as offerings. But even the greatest oceans run dry. When blood and water no longer thrilled the masses, Rome would look for new forms of spectacle, something more intimate, more obscene. If men could die like myths, and fleets could die like storms, what came next would dissolve even the line between morality and madness. Because Rome's next invention wasn't about power over nature, it was about power over identity itself. For centuries, the arena had belonged to men, soldiers, slaves, rebels, and criminals. But as Rome's appetite for novelty deepened, the empire crossed yet another boundary. Now, even women would be thrown into the sand. The audience called them gladiatresses, female gladiators. The poets called them a disgrace. The emperors called them entertainment. To the Roman elite, the sight of women fighting, bleeding, gasping, stripped of modesty, was the final inversion of nature. The empire that had conquered the world was now conquering the body itself. Juvenal, the satirist, mocked them with disgust. Who could bear the sight of a woman sweating beneath her helmet, lunging with a spear? Better she sit at her loom. But he wasn't outraged by their suffering. He was outraged by their defiance. Because every woman who entered the arena shattered the illusion that Rome's order was eternal. The phenomenon began under Emperor Nero. He adored scandal as much as power. At his games, noble women, some from the highest families, were forced to fight in mock duels before cheering crowds. Some volunteered, desperate for imperial favor. Others were coerced, their honor turned into spectacle. They were made to battle dwarfs, beasts, or each other. The pairing itself was the joke. Strength against weakness, beauty against deformity. The laughter of the crowd was the point. In 66 AD, during Nero's festival of Troy, Women from senatorial families fought publicly. They wore gilded armor, their faces hidden behind masks shaped like goddesses. To the crowd, it was art. To the women, it was erasure. The practice grew under Domitian, who made female combat a signature of his rule. His biographer Suetonius recorded battles between women and dwarfs, fights of Amazons against beasts. He even staged them at night by torchlight, so the crowd could savor every movement of the unnatural creatures. The cruelty was layered, physical, sexual, symbolic. Each duel was designed not to honor courage, but to humiliate femininity. And yet, for some, the arena became a space of perverse empowerment. In the ruins of Halicarnassus, archaeologists found a marble relief showing two female gladiators named Amazonia and Achillea, standing victorious, swords raised. The inscription reads, "They fought bravely, they were released." Their freedom was rare and temporary. Even when they survived, they remained curiosities, not citizens. They had defied death, but not Rome. The presence of women in the arena blurred the lines between theatre and pornography. Naked or half-clothed, oiled for spectacle, they became instruments of moral instruction disguised as sin. Philosophers claimed such scenes purified the city by turning vice into warning. In reality, they purified nothing. They only taught the crowd that degradation was normal, that domination could wear the mask of virtue. The irony was bitter. In the same empire that worshipped Venus, goddess of beauty, and Minerva, goddess of wisdom, women were dragged into pits to die before merchants and children. The goddess was eternal, the woman was disposable. Tertullian, the Christian apologist, saw the contradiction clearly. The virgins of Rome are defiled under the eyes of their fathers, and they call it honor. To him, the arena wasn't just a theatre, it was a ritual of desecration, a world where innocence itself was a performance, and death the applause line. Even the architecture reflected this ideology. The Colosseum's tiers were arranged by rank, senators close to the sand, women exiled to the top. Yet when women fought, those same senators leaned forward, laughing as the social order inverted for spectacle. Rome called it equality for an afternoon. But equality under tyranny is only inversion, not justice. The violence against women in the arena wasn't an accident, it was a statement. By forcing women to fight, Rome reaffirmed that power could invade every space, even the body. The empire didn't just own land or labor, it owned anatomy, desire, reproduction. It was the logic of domination, distilled to its purest form, nothing sacred, nothing off limits. One inscription from Pompeii records a show where 40 women fought like men. Another describes a huntress of beasts named Mevia, who speared a lion naked, while the crowd howled her name. The poet Statius praised her Roman courage, but courage had nothing to do with it. Mevia wasn't fighting for glory. She was surviving humiliation. For the audience, it was proof that Rome could command even nature's laws, that femininity itself could be made to bleed for entertainment. Every scream was a sermon on submission. Every drop of blood reminded citizens that in Rome, freedom was not a right, but a privilege, one that could be revoked, inverted, or mocked at any moment. And yet, the empire's obsession with spectacle was consuming itself. As the games grew more perverse, their cost soared. their purpose hollowed. Even the emperors began to lose sight of the difference between performance and power. Soon, the ruler of the world would step into the arena himself, not as a god, but as a showman, a man who mistook the people's fear for love and applause for eternity. Because the next act in Rome's theatre of cruelty would erase even the distance between emperor and executioner. And in doing so, it would reveal how absolute power always ends, not with rebellion, but with performance. By the late 1st century AD, the arena no longer needed imagination. Rome had seen everything: beasts torn apart, women humiliated, men drowned like soldiers in miniature seas. But there was one form of spectacle that still held the crowd's breath: the sight of a human being turned into fire. It began quietly, not in the Colosseum, but in the gardens of Nero's palace. In 64 AD, after a massive fire consumed much of Rome, the emperor needed someone to blame. He accused the Christians, a small, obscure sect, of arson. Then he offered the people a show. Night after night, prisoners were tied to wooden stakes, their bodies coated in pitch and oil. As darkness fell, Nero raised his hand and torches were lit. Human torches. Men, women, even children. The flames burned through the night, lighting Nero's garden parties as guests laughed and musicians played. The Roman historian Tacitus recorded the scene without exaggeration. They were burned to serve as nightly illumination when daylight had expired. It was called punishment, but it was theatre. The idea spread quickly. What Nero began as vengeance became tradition. Public burning joined crucifixion and beheading as a sanctioned form of damnatio. By the 2nd century, the sight of smoke rising from the arena was as familiar as the roar of lions. Tertullian, writing later, called them living torches. He meant it literally. Men and women burned alive to remind Rome of its order, of who ruled and who obeyed. During Emperor Domitian's reign, the punishments grew more elaborate. Some victims were dressed as mythic figures before being set ablaze. Hercules consumed in fire, Phaethon falling from the sky, Prometheus writhing in eternal agony. The crowd applauded the realism. Rome had achieved something that no empire before it had dared: turning morality into pyrotechnics. The philosopher Seneca, who had once admired Rome's discipline, finally broke. He wrote that the spectacles had poisoned the soul of the city. The games, he said, no longer disciplined citizens, but degraded them. Those who love blood grow to hate reason. But his words changed nothing. The economy of death had momentum now. Executions were cheaper than roads, more popular than philosophy, and easier than reform. Every time the empire trembled, a revolt in the provinces, a famine, an assassination, the solution was the same: another spectacle, another body, another fire. The historian Cassius Dio described one such execution during Trajan's reign. Christians were bound to poles, their heads smeared with sulfur, their hair soaked in oil. As the flames caught, the smell of burning flesh spread through the stands. Vendors continued to sell dates and wine. Children cheered. The horror wasn't in the fire, it was in the indifference. To Rome, death was no longer a punishment. It was policy. The Emperor Commodus would later perform these executions personally. He entered the Colosseum dressed as Hercules, striking down crippled animals, decapitating ostriches, and slaughtering prisoners too weak to resist. He called it justice. The philosopher Dio, who witnessed it, wrote, "Each act of cruelty was rehearsed, each death arranged." It was not chaos, it was choreography. Under Commodus, the boundaries between ruler, performer, and murderer dissolved completely. The emperor had become the spectacle, and Rome, addicted to its own reflection, could no longer tell the difference between worship and mockery. But there was still one ritual darker than all others: crucifixion. Borrowed from the East, perfected by Rome, it was the slowest and most public death imaginable. Victims were nailed to wooden beams, their bodies twisted, their lungs collapsing over hours, sometimes days. The Romans called it the most shameful death. They crucified slaves for rebellion, thieves for theft, and Christians for defiance. They did it in the arena, at crossroads, or along city gates, anywhere it could be seen. The Colosseum itself hosted rows of crosses, each bearing a body slowly sagging as the sun rose. Crowds watched between matches. It was not meant to horrify, it was meant to normalize. When cruelty becomes law, empathy becomes treason. The Christian writer Lactantius later described it as a deliberate ritual of domination. The crucified man was not permitted to die quickly, lest mercy soften the gaze of the people. It worked. By the 2nd century, the citizens of Rome could eat lunch beneath the sight of the condemned dying. Vendors passed bread through the crowd. Children played games on the steps. The moral line, that invisible boundary between justice and spectacle, had long since burned away. This was Rome's true achievement: to make death banal, to make horror ordinary. And yet, even as the flames rose and crosses multiplied, something began to shift. The same faith Rome tried to extinguish with fire was spreading, in whispers, in catacombs, in letters, smuggled by slaves. The very people burned as torches became symbols of resistance. The empire wanted obedience. It created martyrs. Tertullian wrote defiantly, "The blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church." He was right. Every burning body illuminated something Rome could not control: conscience. But Rome couldn't stop. Its people were addicted, its rulers desperate. The arena had become the empire's medicine and its disease. Without spectacle, the citizens might remember their hunger, their poverty, their fear. So the fires burned on, and beneath the light of those human torches, the empire's soul, whatever remained of it, slowly turned to ash. Because when a civilization learns to love the sight of burning flesh, it has already begun to burn itself. By the time Commodus took the throne in 180 AD, Rome had already exhausted every form of spectacle imaginable. Men had fought beasts, women had fought dwarfs, seas had been flooded, myths reenacted, entire species hunted to extinction. There was nothing left to conquer, except the emperor himself. Commodus understood this perfectly. He didn't want to be remembered as a ruler. He wanted to be worshipped as a performer. The empire's greatest stage was waiting, and the Colosseum was ready. Every morning, the gates of the arena opened not for gladiators, but for the Emperor of Rome. Dressed in a lion's pelt and wielding a gilded club, Commodus entered the sand as Hercules reborn. Trumpets blared, slaves scattered petals, and the crowd, 50,000 strong, erupted into forced applause. He called himself Hercules Romanus Invictus, the unconquered Hercules of Rome. His strength, of course, was an illusion. Every beast he fought had been crippled beforehand. Every duel was fixed. The gladiators who faced him were given blunted weapons, forbidden to strike. Still, they were executed afterward to maintain the illusion of imperial invincibility. Cassius Dio, the historian who witnessed these performances, wrote in horror, "He slaughtered men as though they were cattle and called it sport. He fought as a gladiator 735 times, and each victory cost the treasury a fortune." This was no longer about religion or punishment. It was about the empire consuming itself, turning even its ruler into spectacle. Commodus understood that in Rome, power no longer came from law or conquest, but from visibility. To be seen was to rule. To vanish was to die. He staged his reign like a play, and every subject was part of his audience. When he appeared in the arena, citizens bowed not to a god, but to a celebrity drenched in blood. When he performed executions, they clapped as though attending theatre. And in their applause, the empire found its new form of obedience, worship through distraction. Commodus didn't just fight animals, he humiliated men. He once ordered a group of wounded soldiers to dress as mythic giants and chained them before him. He struck them down one by one, shouting, "Thus dies the enemies of Rome." The crowd roared. In another act, he lined up dozens of spectators, chosen by lottery, and forced them to watch as he executed their slaves personally, claiming he was purifying their households. No emperor had ever descended this far into the arena's sand, not metaphorically, but literally. For Commodus, the stage was the only place he felt divine. Behind the performances lay a new kind of terror. Every official, every senator, every general knew that failure to cheer might be fatal. One nobleman, absent from a show due to illness, was executed for insulting the emperor's art. Another was forced to fight in the arena himself, unarmed, blindfolded, while Commodus laughed. The historian Herodian wrote, "He mixed blood with banquets, corpses with comedy. Rome became his stage, its people his chorus." Even the calendar changed. Commodus renamed the months after himself, from Lucius, his birth name, to Herculeus, Exuperatorius, Amazonius. He renamed Rome itself Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. The empire's geography had become theatre set design. And yet, for all his madness, Commodus was logical in one thing. He understood that the Roman people had become addicted to illusion. The empire no longer needed generals, it needed showmen. The crowd didn't want order, it wanted distraction. It didn't want leadership, it wanted spectacle. Commodus simply gave them what they had been trained to crave. But there was a price. Each performance drained the treasury. Each rigged duel demanded bribes. Each heroic act required hundreds of slaves to die off stage. Economically, it was suicide disguised as glory. Psychologically, it was collapse disguised as entertainment. The philosopher Marcus Aurelius, Commodus's father, had warned that true power was the mastery of the self. His son reversed it. To Commodus, mastery meant control over others' deaths. That was the moral inversion of Rome, from stoic restraint to sadistic indulgence. An empire that had once conquered through law now conquered through laughter. In Commodus's reign, the Roman state was no longer a machine of governance. It was a stage production, one funded by blood. Senators applauded out of fear. Citizens cheered out of habit. Priests blessed the corpses as sacrifices. Even cruelty had become ritual. By 192 AD, the emperor's madness had turned the city itself into a prison. Statues of Commodus as Hercules lined the streets. Coins bore his image, slaying beasts, crushing serpents, wielding thunderbolts. He declared himself the new founder of Rome and planned to rename the Colosseum the Commodium. But inside the palace, the whispers began. His advisors, exhausted by his tyranny, knew what must come next. One December evening, Commodus prepared for yet another appearance in the arena, this time dressed as a gladiator to open the New Year's games. He would not live to see them. His mistress, Marcia, poisoned his wine. When he vomited but survived, the conspirators sent in his wrestling partner, Narcissus, who strangled him in his bath. The man who had ruled the world from the sand died naked, unseen, surrounded not by applause, but silence. Cassius Dio wrote, "Thus perished the emperor who made the empire a stage, and himself the clown." It was the perfect epitaph. For in Commodus's death, Rome's mirror cracked, revealing what it had become, a civilization addicted to its own reflection. But even with the emperor gone, the arena did not rest. The machine of spectacle kept turning, fueled by habit, greed, and silence. And as the empire aged, one question grew heavier than the roar of any crowd. When a society must watch to believe, when it feeds on its own cruelty, how long can it last before the applause stops? When Commodus's corpse was dragged from the palace, Rome exhaled, not in grief, but exhaustion. The games were suspended, the statues torn down, and for a moment the Colosseum stood silent. But silence in Rome was never peace. It was hunger. Within months, the Senate voted to restore the spectacles. They told themselves it was tradition, but it was addiction. Rome could not exist without its theatre of blood. The philosopher Seneca had once warned, "He who delights in cruelty becomes its slave." 2 centuries later, his prophecy had come true. The empire that once ruled by discipline now ruled by distraction. Citizens who once built aqueducts, mapped the stars, and wrote laws now spent their days queuing for seats in the arena. The applause that once crowned emperors had become the only form of civic participation left. It was no longer about religion or revenge. It was about rhythm, bread, spectacle, forgetting. The Roman poet Juvenal mocked it perfectly. The people now demand only 2 things, bread and circuses. He didn't mean it as a joke. He meant it as an obituary. The collapse of compassion was not sudden. It was trained, rehearsed in the amphitheaters, normalized in the streets. Rome's schools taught rhetoric, law, and obedience. But the arena taught something deeper, that life was a transaction and suffering a resource. Every time a man begged for mercy and the crowd screamed, "Kill him," the social contract rewrote itself. By the 3rd century, no one even questioned it. Violence wasn't an exception to order, it was the proof of order. When archaeologists excavated a provincial amphitheatre in Gaul, they found an inscription carved into the seats. "He who pities the condemned betrays Rome." It wasn't metaphor, it was civic creed. And yet, cracks began to appear, not in the stone, but in the soul. Seneca's words survived like whispers through the empire's conscience. Others followed: Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and the Stoics, who had once justified endurance, now wrote of restraint. Even a few pagan writers began to recoil at the sight of slaughter. One chronicler in Carthage confessed, "We have forgotten the difference between virtue and entertainment." But the machine kept running. Economically, the games had become unsustainable. The Colosseum devoured fortunes. Provinces were taxed specifically to fund spectacles in Rome. Governors competed to outdo one another, not in governance, but in gore. The historian Cassiodorus later described it as an empire bleeding for applause. The moral erosion reached the very core of daily life. Gladiator schools became celebrity factories. Women wore jewelry shaped like tridents. Children played with toy lions. Tavern murals depicted the favorite fighters of the season. Death was everywhere, and invisible. The language itself betrayed the rot. The Latin word pietas, once meaning duty and reverence, came to mean loyalty to the emperor. Virtus, once moral excellence, became military valor. Mercy, clementia, was mocked as weakness. Rome had inverted its virtues. Kindness was treason, cruelty was citizenship. But beneath the noise, a new voice was rising, quiet, defiant, and dangerous. It spoke of humility instead of pride, forgiveness instead of vengeance. It came not from the Senate or the temples, but from the catacombs beneath the streets. It was the voice of those the empire had tried to erase: the Christians, the slaves, the forgotten. Their gospel was treasonous to Roman logic, that every life, even the condemned, had value. That suffering was not entertainment, but a mirror. To the Romans, it was madness. To history, it was the beginning of moral memory. As Christianity spread, the contradictions of the arena grew harder to ignore. How could an empire of law justify so much blood? How could the same people who built libraries and aqueducts watch children burn? Some citizens began refusing to attend the games. Others spoke out. The philosopher Lactantius called the spectacles the school of cruelty. Augustine of Hippo later warned that to watch them was to lose one's soul. But Augustine also knew the truth, that the sickness of spectacle ran deeper than politics or religion. He wrote of his friend Alypius, who swore he would never visit the arena. Dragged there by friends, Alypius closed his eyes as the first cries began. But when the crowd roared, he opened them and was lost. He saw, he shouted, he was drunk with blood, Augustine wrote. He was no longer himself. That was Rome's genius. It didn't just conquer your body, it conquered your gaze. Even as moralists warned and preachers wept, the state refused to stop. The emperors, now more administrators than gods, feared what would happen if the people looked away. The games had become anesthesia for empire. Without the arena, citizens might see the hunger, the taxes, the plagues, the corruption. So long as the blood flowed, Rome could pretend it was still alive. But the applause was getting thinner. By the late 4th century, even the crowd was weary. The beasts were fewer, the treasury emptier. The games that once symbolized eternity now felt like an echo of a vanished world. Then, in 404 AD, something happened that Rome never expected. At a festival celebrating the Emperor Honorius, a gladiatorial match turned brutal. One man fell, defenseless, his opponent poised for the kill. The crowd screamed for blood. But a monk named Telemachus leapt from the stands, shouting, "In the name of Christ, stop this madness!" The mob stoned him to death, but his act broke the spell. Shock rippled through the empire. Within months, the emperor issued an edict banning gladiatorial combat. The arena, the empire's heart for 6 centuries, fell silent. It was over, not with revolution, but with exhaustion. Rome had devoured itself, morally, spiritually, economically. The amphitheaters crumbled, the lions starved, the sand cooled. The empire that once believed cruelty was control now faced its own reflection, a civilization that had taught itself to feel nothing. When compassion collapses, law is an illusion. When empathy dies, empire follows. The last gladiator didn't die in combat. He died in memory, erased by the same silence that once cheered his pain. When the Emperor Honorius outlawed the games in 404 AD, the decree sounded like moral triumph. But it was too late. Rome's addiction to spectacle was not confined to the amphitheatre. It had already seeped into governance, economy, and faith. The empire no longer ruled its people, it entertained them. The poet Juvenal's phrase, panem et circenses, bread and circuses, had begun as satire. By the late empire, it was state policy. Bread fed the stomach, the circus fed the silence. Centuries earlier, the Senate had discovered a political truth as sharp as any sword. Hunger breeds rebellion, but amusement breeds obedience. And so, when taxes rose, or wars dragged on, or emperors changed, Rome's solution was simple: feed the people and distract them. The grain dole, free wheat for citizens, became the lifeline of the city. 500,000 Romans received it monthly. When shipments faltered, riots erupted. The emperors understood the lesson: control the stomach, and you control the soul. Every loaf handed out in the forum was a quiet bribe. Every spectacle in the arena was a sermon in submission. Economically, it was madness. The empire spent more on entertainment than on education, more on free food than on frontier defense. By the 3rd century, maintaining the dole and the games consumed nearly 1/3 of the imperial budget. The historian Ammianus Marcellinus lamented, "No one cares for the state, so long as the people have grain and the theatre." But the emperors could not stop. They were trapped in the very system they had created. When Aurelian tried to cut costs, he faced riots that nearly burned the city. When Diocletian reformed the economy, he kept the games, because he knew no decree could erase habit. Rome was addicted to its own anesthesia. The political mechanics of this addiction were precise. Bread calmed the body. Spectacle paralyzed the mind. Together they formed a loop of dependency, an empire feeding its people not with truth, but with distraction. The crowd no longer wanted justice, it wanted performance. The Senate no longer legislated, it applauded. The emperor no longer commanded, he entertained. Even religion was absorbed into the machinery. Pagan festivals merged with public games, sacred processions became parades, and sacrifice turned into theatre. The line between faith and fandom dissolved. When Constantine legalized Christianity in 313 AD, He did not abolish spectacle, he baptized it. Processions replaced parades, saints replaced gladiators, incense replaced blood. But the logic remained. The people must be watched, fed, awed, and awed. This was Rome's greatest political innovation, and its slowest poison. To rule by spectacle is to exchange governance for hypnosis. The people stop asking why, and start asking when is the next show. The philosopher Aurelius Victor wrote, "The people no longer live in the city, they live in the games." The Forum, once a place of debate, became an empty plaza between feasts. Citizens who had once voted, built, and fought now only waited for bread to arrive and the horns of the next procession to sound. Rome had built not an empire of law, but an empire of attention. And attention, like gold, is finite. When the treasury emptied, the illusions began to crack. The grain ships from Egypt became irregular. The great circuses of Carthage and Antioch fell into disrepair. The Colosseum's marble seats grew chipped and hollow. The emperors tried to maintain the illusion. Coins were minted with slogans like Felicitas Temporum, happiness of the times. But behind the smiling gods, inflation soared and provinces starved. The people no longer cared who ruled them, only that the bread still came. The empire's identity, once rooted in law and conquest, had become transactional, a trade of food for silence, cruelty for unity, spectacle for sovereignty. By the 4th century, the cycle was unbreakable. Each new ruler had to outshine the last in generosity or grandeur. One emperor built a bathhouse, the next flooded it for mock naval battles. One handed out bread, the next distributed pork and olive oil. The imperial court became a performance troupe, the Senate an audience, the citizens dependents. The poet Rutilius wrote bitterly, "Rome's people sell their loyalty for a loaf." It was not cynicism, it was diagnosis. And yet, within the decay, something remarkable occurred. The new faith, Christianity, began using the empire's own tools against it. The church understood the psychology of spectacle better than any emperor. It replaced the arena's violence with ritual drama, martyrdom with sainthood, public cruelty with moral theatre. Where Rome had taught obedience through fear, the church taught obedience through guilt. Where Rome had staged bodies, the church staged souls. The audience changed, but the architecture of attention remained. The transition was not redemption, it was mutation. When the Colosseum finally closed, Rome did not end its need for awe, it simply changed its stage. Cathedrals replaced amphitheaters. The masses no longer cheered for blood, they wept for salvation. But the same hunger for emotion, spectacle, and control pulsed beneath the hymns. An empire that had once ruled through cruelty now ruled through conscience. But the dependency was the same. Looking back, the lesson is stark. Bread and circuses did not merely distract the people, they rewired them. The arena was not just a monument of stone, it was a machine for shaping perception, a prototype of propaganda. Rome fell, not when the barbarians crossed the gates, but when its citizens stopped caring who opened them. Because when a civilization chooses comfort over conscience, it dies long before its walls collapse. The Colosseum still stands. Its arches glow gold in the Roman dusk. its tunnels quiet except for tourists' footsteps and the cooing of pigeons. But beneath those stones lies the truest chronicle of the empire, not written in marble, but in calcium. Bones, tens of thousands of them, buried beneath layers of sand and ash. Gladiators, slaves, prisoners, beasts, all reduced to the same dust. Rome's final ledger. If the empire's poets glorified its victories, the earth kept its receipts. Archaeologists have uncovered fractured skulls, shattered ribs, and animal bones carved with knife marks. Lions starved before shows, humans branded like livestock. Forensic evidence reveals what Rome never admitted. The Colosseum wasn't only a monument to engineering, it was a factory of annihilation. Each skeleton tells the same story: power without empathy, spectacle without meaning, empire without soul. And yet, the stones whisper something deeper. That cruelty, however grand, never lasts. That silence, however heavy, never holds. The bones still speak. When the games ended in the 5th century, it wasn't moral enlightenment that stopped them. It was exhaustion. The treasury was empty, the beasts extinct, the audience disillusioned. The empire had spent 6 centuries feeding its hunger for control until there was nothing left to consume. And in that void, something else began to grow: conscience. The same faith Rome tried to burn began reclaiming its ruins. Monks prayed where men once died. Crosses replaced statues of emperors. The amphitheatre became a tomb. And then, a warning. By the Middle Ages, pilgrims called it the martyr's arena. The site of spectacle had become a shrine. But history has a cruel sense of symmetry. Rome's legacy didn't die with its empire. It evolved. The amphitheatre became blueprint. Wherever power needed to control the masses, it revived Rome's oldest weapon: spectacle. From the French guillotine to public hangings, from political rallies to televised wars, the principle remained unchanged. Keep the crowd watching. Keep them feeling. Keep them from thinking. The arena never vanished. It just changed its architecture. And that is the paradox Rome left behind: civilization's obsession with its own reflection. Every age claims to be more humane, more rational, more free. Yet every age builds its own arena. Some use swords, others use screens. The mechanics are the same. Violence turned to entertainment, suffering turned to performance, morality replaced by metrics. Rome didn't just teach law or architecture. It taught the psychology of complicity, how to make cruelty feel necessary, even noble. That is why the Colosseum still chills us. Because deep down, we recognize it. When we walk its tunnels today, it isn't the blood that terrifies, it's the logic. The rows of seats ascending like a pyramid of hierarchy. The sand perfectly raked to absorb the next spill of blood. The trapdoors that could lift lions, flames, or men at the turn of a crank. Every detail was precise, efficient, rational. That's the horror. Rome didn't commit chaos. It committed order. Cruelty wasn't madness. It was administration. The empire fell, but its method survived: the bureaucratization of pain. And yet, amid that ruin, there remains a whisper of defiance, not from emperors or senators, but from those erased, From the nameless woman forced into the bronze bull, from the slaves who fought at a funeral so their masters could prove devotion, from the monk who died begging the crowd to stop. They were not heroes in their time, they were witnesses. Their bones tell us what marble cannot. That empire, however grand, is mortal. That power built on cruelty always collapses under its own applause. History remembers the emperors' names: Nero, Titus, Commodus. But the bones remember everyone else. And so, when we stand before the Colosseum, we aren't just looking at ruins, we're looking at a mirror. Because the big question that haunted Rome still hangs in the air. How does a civilization that calls itself lawful turn violence into virtue? How does it convince millions to cheer for cruelty and believe it's justice? The answer lies not in the past, but in the pattern. Rome's story was never just about gladiators. It was about governance through emotion, loyalty through fear, and obedience through awe. It was about how a society loses its soul, one spectacle at a time. Today, the arena is empty, but the instinct remains. Every empire, every nation, every screen that trades truth for applause builds its own Colosseum, not from stone, but from silence. And one day, when our own ledgers close, the ground beneath us will keep the same record Rome did: bones. Proof that the cost of glory was always the same, and always paid in flesh, completed.